مرحبا جميعون شكرا لوجودكم.
Great.
Apologies for my lack of Arabic, but thank you so much for having me and for facilitating my lack of Arabic. So it's really a pleasure to be here and an honor to be here with you all, and especially to talk about such an important subject. It's really amazing listening to all the different wisdom here and knowledge, and it's so sad to think of how this is such a global issue. So I'm just going to speak a little bit about the situation here in Ireland, some of the things that we've done to try and deal with the problem, and yeah, just to give a little bit of information maybe from Europe as well. So to start off with some difficult statistics about the situation in Ireland, a European Union Fundamental Rights Agency reported that 14% of women have experienced physical violence from a partner, 6% have experienced sexual violence from a partner, 31% psychological violence, 12% have experienced stalking, and 41% of Irish women know somebody or has somebody in their immediate circle who they now know is suffering from domestic violence of some sort. In an EU context, the European Union Fundamental Rights Agency also reported that 47% of women aged 18 to 29 in the European Union have experienced psychological violence inflicted by an intimate partner, and 20% of women in the European Union aged 18 to 29 have experienced physical or sexual violence from an intimate partner. And as we all probably know, the statistics that we have are so much fewer than the reality because so much of the violence is unreported. So it's always, as we know, the tip of the iceberg really that actually becomes reported and becomes into statistics and common knowledge, unfortunately. So another thing that's greatly impacted the domestic violence here in Ireland, and I'm sure in other areas, is the impact of COVID-19 and the lockdowns, etc., that have happened. So COVID-19 has really increased the danger. It's restricted the support systems that are available to women. It's put more pressure on the already overloaded services that are in place, and it's caused increased isolation and vulnerability of victims where we have been cut off from seeing people who care or people just having contact outside of the family unit. In Ireland, the lockdowns were quite strict in terms of only being allowed very close to your own home. So for a lot of victims, they were totally cut off from their normal support structures. And also for children in abusive situations, they weren't allowed to go to school and they had no contact with teachers or other caregivers in their normal life, which put them further at risk. And we saw this with the statistics or with the increase in calls to support services in Ireland. So during the first 3 months of lockdown, Women's Aid, which is one of the best known domestic violence support groups in the country, reported a 71% increase in visits to their website, a 43% increase in calls. And some of these calls included women who had been strangled, who had been raped, who had been beaten in their homes and were desperately seeking help. The police reported a 25% increase between April and May 2020 alone. And the Crime Victims Helpline recorded a 135% increase in domestic violence related contacts in 2021. So as you can see, the increase has been staggering as people were kind of trapped in their homes. Women had no outlet and they'd no way of exiting the situation if the violent spouse was suddenly working from home rather than being in an office or working elsewhere. Meanwhile, the capacity in services such as domestic violence refuges decreased by 25% due to the social distancing regulations that were in place. Outreach workers were unable to actually go and meet the victims in person. Everything had to be done, over the phone or online, which again, for some women in domestic violence situations is just not possible. Children in abusive homes, as I said, were cut off from their normal supports in schools and their teachers. So some of the domestic violence that's reported in Ireland, some of the different types are, say, physical violence, sexual violence, harassment and stalking, psychological and emotional abuse, online and digital abuse, and coercive control. And so for women trying to fight these through court and get support, obviously some more than others are more obvious, and some are far more difficult to prove and to even define in the first place. And so that's an area where women can really get lost and fall through the cracks because they don't have anyone to support them in knowing how to even define the abuse that's happening to them. So there's an enormous need for education for everybody involved. In terms of systemic issues, again, there are huge issues for women who are trying to escape a situation or else get some kind of justice for what's been done to them. And some of these issues are, of course, one is the fact that there's a lower socioeconomic status for women, which can create economic hostages where they know that if they leave, they will not be able to provide for their children. And that keeps them often in a dangerous situation because they feel there's no other option due to economics. A lack of trust in the authorities and the judicial system is another reason why women sometimes will not report or not feel safe enough to report. For example, in the United Kingdom, one woman every week is coming forward to report their partner who is in the police force is seriously abusing them or their children. So there's then a lot of different women who are coming out saying that they have been silenced, that when they did report a partner who was in the police service, that it was covered up, that they were silenced and their testimony disregarded. So one former police commander in the UK described officer-perpetrated domestic abuse as an epidemic within the force. So when women are aware of this, they feel they won't be believed and they feel that they will not actually have any support if they do go to those who are supposed to be supporting them. In Ireland, another issue for women is that if they report domestic abuse in the home around children, then the Child and Family Agency comes in to investigate. Now, that should not be an issue, but we had a number of years ago the Child and Family Agency involved in an enormous scandal where a police whistleblower was targeted by members of the Child and Family Protection Agency who created absolutely horrendous lies about this particular whistleblower who exposed corruption within the police force, and some really, really terrible things were done and really damaged that man's life. So when there's scandals like this about an agency that has the power to come in and take your children if they feel there's a need to do so, women are terrified naturally. So often that will be enough to prevent women reporting abuse because they're afraid, they don't have the trust in the agency that will come in to determine whether or not their children are safe with them, even if they are not the ones who obviously have been abusive. It's another reason why women are scared. Then when it comes to the judicial system, Women's Aid, again, did a report on the judicial system and its efficacy. And their findings pointed to a really fragmented system, which breaks up years of abuse into separate incidents, making it incapable of tackling the persistent nature and cumulative impact of domestic violence. And so an example we have of this is if a woman goes to court and manages to obtain a protection order, if there's a breach of that protection order, when she goes back to court, it becomes a criminal case. And the only evidence that can be taken for that breach is from the specific incident. So you could have a situation of abuse, of violent abuse that's gone on for 20 years, but all that judge will be made aware of in the case of a breach in the criminal court is the specific incident, which may be far more minor than the overall picture, but the judge is not privy to that, to any other information during the court case, which means that often perpetrators will get a far weaker sentence than is deserved, leaving women and children with far less protection than they actually need. The same report found serious gaps in official statistical data on domestic violence related crimes, and when they interviewed women who had engaged in the judicial system, the majority did not feel safer or have a sense of justice after going through court. And again, they felt that they were unsure or they would not go through the process again. So for the majority of women that actually have the bravery to go through the judicial system, for the majority, they feel that it was not worthwhile, they're not safer, and they don't have any justice, and they would not do it again, which leaves them in a situation often where they just stay in an abusive relationship or stay in a dangerous situation, which is obviously an incredible failing on behalf of our system here. So possible solutions. I think something that we really need to focus on here in Ireland is legislation that reflects the complex nature of domestic violence. And this would include a complete overhaul in the judicial approach to domestic violence, and for it to be informed by victims and by frontline outreach workers who understand the complexities of how these situations work and how best to protect women and children. Also, we had in 2019 coercive control legislation introduced in Ireland. So the definition of coercive control is that it recognizes a persistent controlling behavior that seriously impacts the victim, and it recognizes this as a crime. So this is a real step forward because it allows victims of consistent abuse to actually bring that forward and for it to be treated as a crime, and where it's not such a gray area anymore. So that's been really helpful in allowing people to kind of define and then try and prosecute that kind of abuse, which beforehand was not really defined properly in legislation. Also, of course, we need massive funding for vital services such as our refuges, supports that enable women to leave, but to also provide the kind of care afterwards for women and children who have been traumatized, that they can move forward, that they can form relationships again that are healthy, and that they can recover after their situation, as well as getting them out of there in the first place. They need the support so that they can recover and rebuild their lives after the trauma of domestic violence and abuse. Also ending the silence in terms of around the media. Often there's been cases here where there has been familicides, and the woman has nearly been cut out of the story. The narrative is often very towards the person who has murdered the family is often very sympathetic. So there's very mixed messaging to men in terms of men's violence, both from the media and from society at large. And that's something.
Sorry, please, you have 2 minutes. Two more minutes.
Perfect.
Okay?
Thank you. So we are trying to build awareness amongst men, and for men to feel obligated to accept responsibility. So one of my friends who I work with in the UK, he's trying to develop this triple pledge campaign to end male violence against women, which will be a pledge that men take to not commit psychological, physical, or sexual violence towards women and girls, to pledge to publicly condemn men who commit, normalize, or trivialize violence against women and girls, and a pledge to prevent other men from committing violence against women and girls. So I think men taking on the obligation to protect women and girls in the society is also an enormous challenge that we have to face, and something that we want to encourage. So yeah, thank you so much for
thank you so